Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Amit Harari, and coming up in today's newscast, Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog urging sides to stop the madness, unveiling compromise on legal overhaul. Meantime, thousands of workers all around the country getting the day off to gather for protest at the Knesset against the judicial reform. And start preparing your wallets for Valentine's Day, because we have a beautiful gift suggestion for you. In a primetime address to the nation, Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog last night appealed for dialogue between the nation's leaders on the government's controversial judicial reform. The Israeli president also presented his own 5-point plan to kickstart the process.
אנחנו כבר מזמן לא בוויכוח פוליטי, אלא על סף קריסה חוקתית וחברתית.
These are words from the rare primetime television speech by President Yitzhak Herzog, whose role usually being uniting all citizens, and this time included an appeal to coalition lawmakers to hold off on initial legislation steps in parliament, which some had planned to begin this week. This while Herzog presenting a 5-point compromise plan, including first, the legislation of basic law legislation that anchors the special status of basic laws. The High Court then will not be able to hear cases on basic laws. The court will have the power to cancel laws that contradict basic laws, but the Knesset will have the ability to override these in a mechanism to be negotiated. Second, a broad plan already in the upcoming budget to decrease the immense workload of the courts, which leads them to be ineffective and for cases to drag on for years. Third, a national plan to restore public trust in the judicial system. Fourth, a change in the Judicial Selection Committee without giving any of the branches complete control or an automatic majority. Fifth, and finally, to define the reasonableness clause by negotiation such that it is not cancelled completely but also not used lightly by the courts. Herzog then appealed for a temporary halt in the legislative process only hours before Justice Minister Yariv Levin was due to present legislation for a first reading in the Knesset. This while Herzog has been acting behind the scenes in order to bring the sides to the negotiating table. It's a day of political consequence in Israel, with the coalition presenting its plan for a judicial overhaul to the Knesset for initial vote, while outside, opposition groups stage a general strike and mass protest. ILTV Steve Leibovitz reports.
As presented by Justice Minister Levin, the coalition's proposals would severely restrict the High Court's mandate to strike down laws and government decisions, with an override clause enabling the Knesset to re-legislate struck-down laws with a bare majority of 61. It gives the government effective control over the selection of judges. It also prevents the court from using a test of reasonableness to judge legislation and government decisions. Other provisions, including allowing ministers to appoint their own legal advisors instead of advisors operating under the direction of the Justice Ministry. The government's proposal has faced sharp criticism from numerous top current and former jurists, including Supreme Court President Esther Chayut and Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. Former Attorney General Avichai Mendelblit said that the sweeping reform of the legal and judicial system would be, quote, regime change that would eliminate the independence of Israel's legal system from end to end. Critics say that along with other planned legislation, the sweeping reforms will impact Israel's democratic character by upsetting its system of checks and balances, granting almost all power to the executive branch and leaving individual rights unprotected and minorities undefended. Levin rejects the criticism, saying the judicial reform is long overdue and would rebalance the system of checks and balances that have been heavily weighted on the side of the courts. Prime Minister Netanyahu has allowed Levin to take the lead and insists that the draft law could be tweaked, and critics were exaggerating the proposed changes. Netanyahu says that the opposition's claims that these minor corrections equal the end of democracy are both wrong and prevent any real compromise in the Knesset. Today, opposition groups to the judicial overhaul are staging a nationwide strike to coincide with the first rounds of voting on the legislation, an escalation in the weekly mass protests against the contentious proposals. In addition to the rally outside the Knesset in Jerusalem at midday, protests were staged simultaneously in other cities.
Hundreds of tech startups, law firms, and other private sector companies today allowing tens of thousands of their employees to join a nationwide strike against the government's plan for a judicial overhaul. And joining us now with more about it is ILTV Jerusalem correspondent Steve Leibovich. Hi, Steve. Tense day. So does it look like the coalition is heeding President Herzog's message to compromise on the legislation for judicial reform?
In a word, no. In 2 words, hell no. Just hours after the president finished his speech, the committee chair, Simcha Rotman, continued pushing the bill as prepared by the Justice Ministry, by Justice Minister Levine, and pushed it through the committee. However, having said that, Justice Minister Levine had been expected to bring the first parts of the bill for a first reading in the Knesset. That's been delayed. It's not going to take place today. It'll probably take place either next Monday or Wednesday.
And there was pandemonium in the law committee where over a dozen opposition MKs were expelled from the room. Pretty harsh videos. Does it appear that there is a political way forward to reach a compromise?
Not now. The opposition, certainly the Knesset opposition, had a very clear message today, and that is the president called for a pause. You're saying no, you're bringing it before the committee. And that's when the committee became something of a circus, as over a dozen, 14 Knesset members, mostly from Yesh Atid, started jumping over tables, started shouting, started screaming, started challenging the committee's ways of operating. And they had to be physically expelled from the room. That's as far as the Knesset discussion got. It passed through the committee. Rotman continued as though the president had not even spoken.
And what's happening outside in Jerusalem? You were there this morning in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, speaking of the size of the protest, the voices that are heard.
Well, it may be one of the largest protests that I've ever attended, and I've been covering Israel for over 40 years, I would say. As of the last that I heard, there are 90,000 in Jerusalem that came from all over the country. I know that the train stations and bus stations have been completely overwhelmed. These are entire family units carrying Israeli flags, proud Israeli Zionists whose message is that they think a mistake is being made about the way this reform is being done, and they want their voices to be heard. I would say that today it's estimated that as many as 1 million people participated in some part of the general strike that was called, but it's really hard to gauge exactly how many.
So inside, the coalition is busy pushing forward, while outside, tens of thousands of protesters with a message that Israel, its democracy is under siege. How will the day end and how will it be remembered?
That's hard to say. I do say this. I know that there are a number of Likud Knesset members that have been urging Prime Minister Netanyahu to find a way to pause, because they see the streets. They understand that this is a very, very serious and widespread protest. They've heard the voices of the leading economists in the country and the world. They've heard the voices of the leading judicial authorities in the country and indeed the world. And some of them are willing to say, maybe we should take a pause and negotiate this agreement, and that's the way to go. We've not yet heard from Netanyahu, who's actually, by the way, not even allowed to